Richard Stone suffered a massive heart attack and woke up in his private hospital bed to hear a weak voice from the next room saying, "My son, I finally found you." He couldn't recognize the voice, but it reminded him of lullabies from his childhood. When he turned his head, he saw an elderly woman on her deathbed, and at that moment he discovered the biggest lie of his 40-year life. Richard Stone had built his empire on the principle that emotion was weakness and family was a luxury he couldn't afford. At 54, he controlled Stone Petroleum, a $40 billion oil conglomerate that stretched across 6 continents. His name was synonymous with ruthless business practices and an iron will that had crushed countless competitors over the decades. But none of that mattered now as Richard lay in the intensive care unit of Mount Sinai Hospital, machines beeping steadily around him, keeping track of a heart that had nearly given up 3 days ago. The doctors had called it a massive myocardial infarction, brought on by decades of stress, poor diet, and the relentless pursuit of power at any cost. Richard had been in the middle of negotiating a hostile takeover of a rival company when the chest pains began. True to form, he had ignored them, pushing through the discomfort because weakness was not an option in his world. It wasn't until he collapsed in the boardroom, his expensive suit soaked with sweat and his face gray with pain, that he finally admitted something was seriously wrong. Now, lying in the hospital bed with 4 lines running into his arms and oxygen tubes in his nose, Richard felt more vulnerable than he had since childhood. The irony wasn't lost on him that for all his wealth and power, he was just as mortal as anyone else. Money couldn't buy him a new heart, and influence couldn't negotiate with the Grim Reaper. The private suite was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant sounds of the hospital corridor. Richard had insisted on the most expensive accommodations available, partly out of habit and partly because he didn't want other patients or visitors to see him in this weakened state. His reputation as an invincible business titan couldn't afford to be damaged by images of him lying helpless in a hospital bed. But the isolation also meant he had too much time to think, something Richard had spent decades avoiding. When you build your life on constant motion and endless deals, stillness forced you to confront thoughts and feelings you'd rather keep buried. And right now, those thoughts were taking him back to places he'd sworn never to revisit. The orphanage. St. Catherine's Home for Children. Richard had been dropped off there when he was 7 years old, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small stuffed bear that he'd clutched like a lifeline. The social worker had told him his mother would come back for him someday, that she just needed time to get back on her feet. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, and she never came. Richard had learned to stop hoping. Hope was dangerous in a place like St. Catherine's, where children were shuffled in and out like inventory in a warehouse. The ones who adapted were the ones who learned not to need anyone, not to trust promises, not to believe in fairy tale endings. Richard had adapted better than most. By the time he aged out of the system at 18, Richard had already developed the cold, calculating demeanor that would serve him well in the business world. He'd learned that the only person you could count on was yourself, that emotional attachments made you vulnerable, and that power was the only protection against being abandoned again. He'd built Stone Petroleum from nothing, starting with a single oil lease in Texas that he'd purchased with money earned from working 3 jobs while attending community college. Every deal, every acquisition, every hostile takeover had been driven by the same fundamental fear, that if he wasn't strong enough, rich enough, powerful enough, he would end up alone and abandoned again. But here he was, 54 years old with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and he was still alone. He had no wife, no children, no close friends. His relationships were all transactional, based on what people could do for him or what he could get from them. The heart attack had been a brutal reminder that all the wealth in the world couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. A soft sound from the adjoining room interrupted Richard's dark thoughts. Through the thin wall separating the private suites, he could hear labored breathing and the occasional whispered conversation between medical staff. Another patient, probably in worse condition than he was, judging by the frequency of the nurse's visits. Richard tried to ignore it. Other people's problems had never been his concern. But something about the rhythm of the breathing, the quiet desperation in the whispered voices, reminded him of nights at the orphanage when one of the younger children would cry themselves to sleep, And the older kids would try to comfort them even though they were all just as scared and alone. "Sir, how are you feeling?" Dr. Martinez, Richard's cardiologist, entered the room with a tablet in hand and a professional smile on his face. "Your latest tests are showing significant improvement. We're optimistic about your recovery. When can I get out of here?" Richard asked, his voice still hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed the day before. "I have meetings scheduled, deals that need my attention." Dr. Martinez frowned. "Mr. Stone, you suffered a major heart attack. Your body needs time to heal. The stress that caused this episode in the first place won't disappear just because you're feeling better. We need to talk about lifestyle changes, stress management, possibly stepping back from some of your responsibilities." "Stepping back isn't an option," Richard replied flatly. "The company needs me." "The company won't exist if you don't exist," Dr. Martinez countered. "You're 54 years old, Mr. Stone. You could have decades of life ahead of you if you're willing to make some changes. Or you could have another episode next month that kills you. The choice is yours." After the doctor left, Richard lay staring at the ceiling, wrestling with concepts that were foreign to his nature. Slowing down. Delegating. Admitting that he wasn't invincible. These weren't just business decisions, they were fundamental challenges to everything he'd built his identity around. The breathing from the next room had become more labored, and Richard could hear medical staff moving around more urgently. Whoever was in there was fighting for their life, just as he had been 3 days ago. Despite himself, Richard felt a twinge of sympathy for the unknown patient. "Please," a weak voice drifted through the wall, barely audible but somehow piercing through Richard's mental barriers. "Please, let me see him one more time. I've been looking for so long." The voice was that of an elderly woman, probably in her 70s or 80s based on its frail quality. But there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at a memory Richard couldn't quite grasp. He found himself straining to hear more, curious despite his usual indifference to other people's situations. "Ma'am, you need to rest," a nurse's voice replied gently. "The doctors are doing everything they can. Is there someone we should call? Family members?" "No family," the woman whispered, and Richard could hear the heartbreak in those 2 words. "Just me. Always just me. But I had a son once. I had a beautiful little boy, and I lost him. I've been looking for him for so long, but I don't think I'll ever find him now." Richard's chest tightened, and not from his heart condition. The woman's words resonated with his own experience of abandonment, of being the child who was lost and never found. For a moment, he felt an unfamiliar urge to comfort her, to tell her that somewhere out there, her son was probably thinking about her too. But that would be a lie. Richard had spent years teaching himself not to think about his mother, not to wonder why she'd left him, not to hope that she might someday explain or apologize. It was easier to believe she'd simply chosen not to come back than to imagine that something had prevented her from finding him. The activity in the next room intensified. Richard could hear more medical staff arriving, urgent conversations about medications and procedures. The woman was dying, and she was dying alone, still searching for a son who might not even know she existed. "My baby," the woman's voice came again, weaker now but somehow reaching directly into Richard's chest. "My sweet little Richie. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you." Richard's blood turned to ice. Richie. No one had called him Richie since he was 7 years old. Since before the orphanage, when his name had been Richard but everyone who loved him called him Richie. The social workers at St. Catherine's had used his full name, making it formal and distant. Over the years, he'd become Richard to everyone, then Mr. Stone, then simply Stone to those who feared him. But Richie. That name belonged to a little boy who had believed his mother would come back for him. A little boy who had clutched a stuffed bear and listened for her voice in every footstep, every car that passed, every phone call that might bring news of her return. "Nurse," Richard called out, his voice urgent now. "Nurse." A young woman in scrubs appeared in his doorway. "Yes, Mr. Stone? What do you need?" The woman in the next room, Richard said, struggling to sit up despite the protests from his aching chest. What's her name? How long has she been here? The nurse looked confused by the question. I'm sorry, sir, I can't discuss other patients' information. Privacy regulations. Please, Richard said, and the desperation in his own voice surprised him. I think I might know her. What's her name? The nurse hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and the urgency in Richard's voice. I really can't. Mr. Stone, you should focus on your own recovery right now. Her name is Margaret, isn't it? Richard said, the memory surfacing like a bubble rising from the depths of a lake. Margaret Stone. She's about 78 years old, brown eyes, a small scar on her left hand from a burn. The nurse's eyes widened in surprise. How did you? Mr. Stone, are you related to Mrs. Stone? I think she's my mother, Richard whispered, the words feeling strange and impossible as they left his lips. I think she's the mother who left me at an orphanage 47 years ago. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. The nurse called Dr. Martinez, who arrived with a confused expression and a lot of questions that Richard couldn't answer. Hospital administrators were consulted, privacy waivers were signed, and suddenly Richard found himself being wheeled on a gurney into the room next door. The woman lying in the bed was small and frail, her hair white and thin, her face deeply lined with age and suffering. But her eyes, when they opened and focused on Richard's face, were the same brown eyes he remembered from his earliest childhood. Eyes that had looked at him with love before everything went wrong. Richie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh my God, is it really you? Richard couldn't speak. He could only stare at this woman who had haunted his dreams and shaped his fears for 47 years. She looked so much older than he'd imagined, so much frilier. In his mind, she had remained frozen at the age she'd been when she left him, but time had continued to pass for her just as it had for him. Mom, he finally managed to say, the word feeling foreign after decades of disuse. You're here. You're really here. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I never stopped looking for you, baby. Never. Not a single day went by that I didn't think about you, didn't wonder where you were, if you were safe, if you were happy. Why? Richard asked, the question that had tormented him for nearly 5 decades finally finding voice. Why did you leave me there? Why didn't you come back? Margaret's face crumpled with grief and regret. I was so young, Richie. Only 19 when you were born. Your father left when he found out I was pregnant, and I had no family, no support, no money. I was living in my car, barely able to feed myself, let alone take care of a baby. She paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking clearly exhausting her. I thought St. Catherine's would be temporary. Just a safe place for you to stay while I got back on my feet. I got a job, saved money, found an apartment. But when I came back to get you 6 months later, they told me you'd been adopted. They said the records were sealed, that I couldn't see you anymore. Richard felt the ground shifting beneath him. Adopted? But I was never adopted. I lived at St. Catherine's until I was 18. They lied to me, Margaret whispered, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. I spent years trying to find you through legal channels. I hired lawyers I couldn't afford, private investigators who took my money and delivered nothing. The orphanage kept telling me you were happy with your new family, that I needed to let you go. The magnitude of the deception hit Richard like a physical blow. For 47 years, he had believed his mother had abandoned him, had chosen not to come back for him. But she had tried. She had fought to find him, and the system had kept them apart. I never stopped believing I would find you someday, Margaret continued. Even when everyone told me to give up, even when the years passed and you became an adult who didn't need me anymore. I kept looking, kept hoping. When I saw your picture in the business magazines, when I realized who you'd become, I tried to contact you. But your assistants, your security people, they all said you didn't want to be bothered by people from your past. Richard thought about all the calls and letters that had been filtered out over the years, all the people his staff had turned away to protect his privacy and preserve his time for more important matters. How many of those had been from his mother, trying desperately to reach him? "I'm dying, Richie," Margaret said softly. "The doctors say I have maybe hours, maybe days. But finding you here, being able to see your face one more time, it's like a miracle. Like God finally heard all my prayers." "Don't talk like that," Richard said, his voice breaking. "We just found each other. There's so much I need to know, so much time we need to make up for." "Tell me about your life," Margaret whispered. "Tell me you've been happy. Tell me you found love, found peace." Richard looked into his mother's eyes and saw nothing but love and hope, despite everything they'd both lost. And he couldn't lie to her, not now, not when these might be their last moments together. "I haven't been happy," he admitted. "I've been successful, powerful, wealthy beyond measure. But I've never been happy. I've never let anyone close enough to love me or hurt me. I built walls around my heart so high that no one could climb them, including me." Margaret's hand found his, her touch weak but warm. "Oh, my sweet boy. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that losing me made you afraid to love." "I thought you didn't want me," Richard said, the words he'd carried for 47 years finally finding release. "I thought I wasn't good enough, wasn't worth keeping. I built my whole life around proving that I was valuable, that I mattered, but it never filled the hole you left behind." "You were always enough," Margaret said firmly, with more strength than she'd shown since he'd entered the room. "You were perfect from the moment you were born. You were my whole world, my reason for living. Losing you broke me in ways I never recovered from." They talked through the night, Margaret sharing memories of his early childhood that Richard had forgotten or blocked out. She told him about the songs she used to sing to him, the games they played, the dreams she'd had for his future. She showed him a worn photograph she'd carried in her purse for 47 years, a picture of 3-year-old Richard laughing as she pushed him on a swing. "I kept everything," Margaret whispered. "Every birthday card I couldn't send, every Christmas present I bought hoping I'd find you in time. They're all in storage back home. Pictures of you from newspapers and magazines, articles about your business success. I was so proud of you, even from a distance." As dawn broke through the hospital windows, Margaret's breathing became more labored. The nurses came in more frequently, adjusting medications and checking monitors. Richard knew his time with her was running out, and there was still so much unsaid. "Mom," he said urgently, "I forgive you. For everything. For leaving me, for the years we lost, for all of it. I understand now. You were just a kid yourself, trying to do what you thought was best." "I love you, Richie," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper now. "I have loved you every single day of your life, even when I couldn't be with you. Even when I didn't know where you were or if you were safe. That love never wavered, never diminished. It's the strongest, most real thing I've ever felt." "I love you too, Mom," Richard replied, the words he'd never thought he'd have the chance to say. "I wish we'd had more time." "We have this moment," Margaret said with a peaceful smile. "That's more than I dared to hope for when I woke up this morning. Sometimes God's timing isn't what we expect, but it's exactly what we need." Margaret passed away peacefully just as the sun fully rose, her hand still clasped in Richard's. For the first time in 47 years, she wasn't alone, and for the first time in his adult life, Richard felt the profound peace that comes from finally understanding that he had always been loved. The funeral was small, attended only by Richard and a few of Margaret's elderly neighbors who remembered her as the woman who never stopped talking about her lost son. Richard learned that she had lived in the same small apartment for 30 years, hoping that if he ever came looking for her, he would be able to find her. Her belongings, as she had mentioned, included decades of unopened birthday cards and Christmas presents, all labeled for Richie in her careful handwriting. There were scrapbooks filled with every newspaper article about Stone Petroleum, every magazine feature about Richard's business success. She had followed his career from a distance, proud of his achievements even as she mourned their separation. Among her possessions, Richard found something that broke his heart and healed it at the same time: his old stuffed bear from the orphanage. Somehow, Margaret had managed to retrieve it years ago when she was still searching for him actively. She'd kept it clean and safe, waiting for the day she could return it to him. The experience of finding and losing his mother in the span of a few hours fundamentally changed Richard in ways that no business success ever had. He began to understand that the walls he'd built to protect himself from abandonment had also protected him from love, connection, and the very relationships that could have given his life meaning. Richard took a leave of absence from Stone Petroleum, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He used the time to process his grief, to read through his mother's letters and diaries, and to begin the difficult work of learning how to open his heart to other people. He started small, with genuine conversations with his household staff about their families and dreams. He discovered that his housekeeper had been sending money to support her grandchildren's education, and his driver had been working extra hours to pay for his daughter's medical treatments. These weren't just employees anymore, they were real people with real struggles and triumphs. Richard established the Margaret Stone Foundation in his mother's memory, focusing on family reunification services and support for young single mothers facing the same impossible choices his mother had faced. The foundation worked to reform the foster care and adoption systems that had kept families unnecessarily separated, ensuring that other children wouldn't grow up believing they were unwanted when they were actually desperately loved. When Richard finally returned to Stone Petroleum, he was a different leader. He still made tough business decisions, but he considered the human cost of those decisions in ways he never had before. He implemented family-friendly policies, paid family leave, and support services for employees facing personal crises. More importantly, Richard began to build real relationships with people. He started dating for the first time in years, not looking for transactions or arrangements but seeking genuine connection. He reached out to old colleagues he'd dismissed as weak for prioritizing family over career, apologizing for his previous judgment and trying to understand their perspectives. The changes weren't always easy. Decades of emotional armor couldn't be removed overnight, and Richard sometimes found himself falling back into old patterns of isolation and control. But every time he was tempted to retreat behind his walls, he thought about his mother's words, that love never wavered, never diminished. 5 years after Margaret's death, Richard met Dr. Sarah Chen at a medical conference where he was speaking about the foundation's work. Sarah was a pediatrician who specialized in working with children in foster care, helping them cope with trauma and separation. Their first conversation lasted 6 hours, covering everything from healthcare policy to their shared experiences of loss and healing. Their relationship developed slowly, built on genuine friendship and mutual respect rather than the superficial attractions that had characterized Richard's previous relationships. Sarah understood his struggles with trust and abandonment, while Richard admired her dedication to helping children who reminded him of his younger self. When they married 2 years later, Richard felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. For the first time in his adult life, he had someone who loved him not for his wealth or power, but for who he was underneath all the success and achievement. Sarah helped him continue the work of breaking down his emotional barriers, while he supported her medical practice and advocacy work. They adopted 3 children from the foster care system, siblings who had been separated and were about to be placed in different homes. Richard couldn't bear the thought of children losing each other the way he'd lost his mother, and he was determined to keep this family together. Watching his children grow up, Richard finally understood what his mother had felt when she was forced to leave him at St. Catherine's. The love was so fierce, so protective, that the thought of being separated from them was physically painful. He could imagine how desperate Margaret must have been, how every day without him must have felt like a piece of her heart was missing. Richard made sure his children knew they were loved unconditionally, that no matter what happened in life, they would always have a home with him. He told them stories about their grandmother Margaret, about how love could survive any distance or separation, about how family bonds were stronger than any force that tried to break them. 10 years after Margaret's death, Richard stood in the boardroom of Stone Petroleum, announcing his retirement as CEO. At 64, he was stepping down to focus on his family and the foundation's work. The company was stronger than ever, led by a team of executives who shared his evolved vision of business as a force for social good. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate, Richard told the assembled staff, many of whom had worked with him for decades and witnessed his transformation. It's measured by the relationships you build and the love you give and receive. I spent most of my life believing that vulnerability was weakness, but I've learned that the courage to love and be loved is the greatest strength any of us can possess. After the meeting, Richard visited Margaret's grave, something he did every month to share news about his life and to thank her for the love that had sustained him even when he didn't know it existed. He brought pictures of his children, updates about the foundation's work, and stories about the family he'd been able to build because of the lessons her death had taught him about living. "I found her, Mom," Richard said, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. "I found someone who loves me the way you did, unconditionally and completely. And we're raising children who will never doubt that they're wanted and cherished." A gentle breeze rustled the flowers, and Richard chose to believe it was Margaret's way of telling him she was proud of the man he'd become, the father he'd chosen to be, and the love he'd finally learned to accept and share. Richard Stone had built a $40 billion empire, but his greatest achievement was learning that the most valuable inheritance his mother had left him wasn't money or property, but the capacity to love and be loved. It had taken 47 years and a chance encounter in a hospital room for him to claim that inheritance, but it was never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Sometimes the greatest discoveries happen when we're at our lowest point, when our defenses are down and our hearts are open to possibilities we never considered. Richard's heart attack had nearly killed him, but finding his mother in those final hours had brought him back to life in ways that no medical intervention ever could. The boy who had been abandoned at an orphanage had grown up to become a man who ensured no child would ever feel unwanted or unloved. The son who had believed his mother didn't care had learned that love transcends time, distance, and even death. And the billionaire who had thought success was measured in dollars had discovered that the richest people are those who are surrounded by family, sustained by love, and committed to using their gifts to heal the wounds that separate us from each other.